December 9th, 1943. Frank Sinatra's hands shook as he held the envelope. The return address said United States Selective Service System. Inside was a single piece of paper that would make millions of Americans want him dead. 4 days later, Frank stood in a cold examination room in Newark, New Jersey, wearing only his underwear. A military doctor pressed cold instruments against his ears, looked inside with a light, frowned, made notes on a clipboard. Frank held his breath. The doctor looked up and said 4 words that would haunt Frank for the rest of his life. "You're classified 4F, unfit." Frank exhaled. Relief flooded through him. He could keep singing, keep earning, keep living. But what Frank didn't know, what nobody in that room could have predicted, was that those 4 words would trigger an FBI investigation, turn American servicemen against him, and create a shadow over his career that would never fully disappear. Because in 1943 America, there was only one thing more shameful than being too afraid to fight. It was being too rich and too famous to care. This is the true story of why Frank Sinatra never went to war, the medical condition nobody believed, the FBI files that tried to prove he paid $40,000 to avoid combat, and the soldiers who booed him, threw bottles at him, and swore they'd never forgive him, even when the truth finally came out. To understand why Frank's draft classification became a national scandal, you need to understand what America looked like in December 1943. The war had been raging for 2 years. American boys were dying in the Pacific, in North Africa, in the skies over Europe. Every week, families opened telegrams with 3 terrible words. "We regret to inform you." The numbers were staggering. By December 1943, over 16 million American men had been drafted or enlisted. That's 1 out of every 8 Americans. In some small towns, every single man between 18 and 35 was gone. Farms sat empty. Factories ran on women and teenagers. Main Street America was a place of mothers, wives, and children waiting for news that might never come, and the casualties were mounting. In 1943 alone, over 150,000 American servicemen died. That's 410 deaths every single day, 17 deaths every hour. 1 American soldier dying every 3.5 minutes. The war wasn't an abstraction. It wasn't something happening far away. It was visceral, immediate, and devastating. Meanwhile, Frank Sinatra was untouchable. By late 1943, he'd become the first true American pop idol. The Bobby Soxers, those teenage girls in saddle shoes and pleated skirts, screamed themselves hoarse at his concerts. They fainted. They mobbed him. Police had to escort Frank through crowds of thousands. At the Paramount Theater in New York, 30,000 fans rioted outside when they couldn't get tickets. 30,000 people for one singer. Frank was earning money that seemed obscene in wartime America. His contract with Columbia Records paid him $250,000 a year. His radio appearances brought another $500,000. His film deal with MGM added another $300,000. Over $1 million total, when the average American family earned $2,000 a year, when a soldier's pay was $600 a year. Frank made more in a week than most Americans made in a lifetime. He lived like royalty, a mansion in New Jersey, custom suits from the best tailors in New York, a personal driver, a full-time staff, dinners at the finest restaurants. While the rest of America rationed butter, sugar, and meat, Frank Sinatra wanted for nothing, and America noticed. Frank was 28 years old in 1943, prime fighting age. He was married to Nancy. They had 2 children, Nancy Jr. and Frank Jr., with a third, Tina, on the way. By every measure, Frank had everything to lose and everything to live for. And that's exactly what made servicemen hate him. The draft notice arrived on December 9th. Frank knew it was coming. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 45 was required to register. Frank had registered back in 1940, the year after he left the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra to go solo. Back then, he was nobody, just another singer trying to make it. But by 1943, Frank Sinatra was the voice, and the voice had just been called to serve. The medical examination was scheduled for December 13th, 1943, at the draft board in Newark, New Jersey. Frank showed up at 9 a.m. He arrived in a dark blue suit, trying not to stand out, but the suit probably cost more than the annual salary of every man in that waiting room combined. Frank sat on a wooden bench, surrounded by factory workers, delivery drivers, shop clerks, men with calloused hands and worn shoes, men who couldn't afford to fail this physical, men who wanted desperately to be classified 4F, but knew they wouldn't be. They were too healthy, too ordinary, too expendable. Frank watched them, saw their fear, saw their resignation. These men weren't heroes yet. They were just scared kids who didn't want to die. And Frank felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Shame. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of what he had. Money, fame, options. These men had nothing but the draft notice in their pockets and the prayer that maybe, somehow, they'd fail the physical and get to go home. The physical examination was thorough. Height, weight, vision, reflexes, blood pressure. The doctors checked everything because the military needed men desperately. The war wasn't going as well as the newspaper said. Everybody mattered. Every soldier counted. They weren't looking for reasons to reject people. They were looking for reasons to accept them. But when the doctor examined Frank's ears, he found something. A perforated eardrum in his left ear. Chronic infection. Mastoiditis. The doctor asked Frank about it. Frank explained. Difficult birth. Forceps delivery. The doctor who pulled him into the world in 1915 had used too much force, damaged the ear canal, left a permanent injury. The doctor made notes, conferred with another physician. They looked at Frank's medical history, childhood ear infections, chronic pain. The records confirmed it. This wasn't new. This wasn't fake. This was a legitimate, documented, lifelong condition. The lead doctor stamped Frank's file. Classification 4F, not acceptable for military service. Reason, chronic mastoiditis with perforation of left eardrum. Frank was free to go. Frank walked out of that building at 11:47 a.m. on December 13th, 1943, a free man. He could keep singing, keep earning, keep living. But as he walked to his car, Frank felt something he'd never felt before. Guilt. Deep, crushing guilt. Because every other man in that waiting room wanted what Frank had. Medical rejection, a ticket home, a reason to stay alive. And Frank was the only one who got it. For 2 weeks, Frank kept the news quiet. He told Nancy. She cried with relief, held him tight and thanked God that her husband wouldn't be shipping out. Wouldn't be landing on a beach somewhere under enemy fire. Wouldn't be coming home in a flag-draped coffin. Nancy had grown up watching war widows, women who never remarried, women who wore black for decades, women whose eyes never lost that hollow look. She didn't want to be one of them, Frank told his manager, George Evans. Evans was a practical man, a realist. He said, "Thank God, the show goes on. We keep working, we keep earning." But even Evans looked uneasy. He knew this would be a public relations problem. He just didn't know how big. Frank also told his mother, Dolly, she was a force of nature, a Hoboken political operator who'd pulled strings and broken heads to get Frank where he was. Dolly's reaction surprised him. She didn't celebrate. She just looked at Frank with those hard Sicilian eyes and said, "They're going to hate you for this, and there's nothing you can do about it." She was right, but Frank didn't feel thankful. He felt like a coward, even though he hadn't done anything wrong, even though the medical condition was real. He felt like he cheated death while better men marched toward it. The news broke on December 27th, 1943. A reporter from the Newark Star-Ledger got a tip about Frank's classification. The headline read, "Sinatra classified 4F will not serve." The story was 2 paragraphs. Simple, factual, but the reaction was a firestorm. Within 24 hours, every newspaper in America had picked up the story. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and the tone wasn't neutral, it was accusatory. Singer too delicate for service. Sinatra sits out war while boys die. The voice that's too precious to risk. The letters started immediately. Angry letters, hateful letters, letters from mothers who'd lost sons, letters from soldiers in training camps, letters that said things like, "My boy is 19 and he's in the Pacific. Your boy is 28 and he's in a nightclub. Explain that." And Frank couldn't. Not in a way that made sense. Not in a way that felt fair. George Evans tried to filter the mail, tried to keep the worst letters away from Frank, but there were too many, hundreds a day, then thousands. They came in sacks, piled up in the office, and the tone grew darker. Some threatened violence. "You should be shot for treason. I hope you die in a plane crash. When my son comes home, he's going to find you and make you pay." One letter came from a woman in Iowa. Her son had been killed at Guadalcanal. She sent Frank a photograph of the boy, 20 years old, wearing his uniform, smiling. The letter said, "This is what a real American looks like. He died for you. He died so you could keep singing and getting rich. I hope you choke on every dollar you make." Frank kept that letter, carried it in his wallet for months, a reminder of the price other people paid while he stayed safe. The hate wasn't just in letters. It showed up at his concerts, at stage doors, on the street. People would recognize Frank and spit, call him coward, tell him to go to hell. Frank started traveling with bodyguards, not because of crazed fans, because of angry patriots who wanted to make him hurt. The worst part wasn't the letters, it was the soldiers themselves. In January 1944, Frank performed at a war bond rally in New York. He walked on stage to applause, but mixed in with the cheers were boos, loud, sustained boos, from servicemen in the audience. Frank tried to ignore them, started singing, and someone threw a bottle. It shattered on stage 6 feet from where Frank stood. Frank stopped singing, looked out at the crowd, saw the uniforms, saw the anger, and he understood. To them, he wasn't the voice. He was the coward. George Evans tried to spin it, issued statements. "Mr. Sinatra has a legitimate medical condition. He did not seek deferment. He was classified by military physicians." But nobody cared about the truth. They cared about the optics. And the optics were simple. Rich, famous singer stays home. Poor, unknown boys go to war. It didn't matter that Frank hadn't asked for the classification. It didn't matter that the condition was real. All that mattered was that Frank was safe and 16 million other men weren't. Then came the anonymous letter. On February 14th, 1944, someone sent a letter to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The letter was typed, no signature, no return address. But the accusation was specific and damning. Frank Sinatra paid $40,000 to bribe military doctors to classify him as 4F. Investigate this immediately. A concerned citizen. Hoover read the letter, and he acted. Because Hoover hated celebrities, hated their power, hated their influence, hated that they could sway public opinion. Hoover believed that Hollywood was infested with communists and degenerates. And Hoover especially hated the idea that someone could buy their way out of military service while real Americans died for their country. The FBI investigation began on February 17, 1944. It was thorough. It was invasive. It was designed to destroy Frank if any evidence of wrongdoing existed. FBI agents interviewed the doctors who examined Frank. They reviewed his medical records going back to childhood. They interviewed the nurses present during his birth in 1915. They talked to Dr. Vincent Cavalier, the physician who delivered Frank with forceps. The doctor, now 70 years old, confirmed the difficult birth, confirmed the injury, showed them his original notes from December 12, 1915. FBI agents interviewed Frank's childhood pediatrician, Dr. Herman Spitzer. He confirmed years of chronic ear infections, showed them records of 3 surgical procedures Frank underwent between ages 5 and 11, all attempting to repair the damaged eardrum. All unsuccessful. The medical paper trail was extensive and consistent. They interviewed ear specialists, asked them to evaluate Frank's medical records independently. Every specialist reached the same conclusion: the mastoiditis was real. The perforated eardrum was permanent, and in combat conditions, it would be dangerous, not just to Frank, to any soldiers depending on him to hear commands, hear enemy movement, hear incoming fire. One specialist wrote in his evaluation, "This condition is incompatible with military service. Classification as 4F is not only appropriate but necessary." They also investigated Frank's finances, bank records, tax returns, looking for a $40,000 payment, looking for any evidence of a bribe, any cash withdrawal, any suspicious transaction. They checked Frank's manager's accounts, his accountant's records, his lawyer's files. They interviewed his bank president. They subpoenaed records going back 5 years. They were looking for proof. They expected to find it. They wanted to find it. The investigation lasted 4 months, and in June 1944, the FBI issued its report, 47 pages long, stamped confidential. The conclusion was clear and unambiguous. No evidence exists to support the allegation that Frank Sinatra bribed military physicians. Medical records confirm chronic mastoiditis and perforated eardrum dating to birth trauma in 1915. Classification as 4F appears medically sound and properly administered. No criminal wrongdoing detected. The FBI had cleared Frank Sinatra, but the report was classified. The public never saw it. The newspapers never reported it. And the accusation, once made, could never be fully erased. Frank was cleared, but nobody knew, and nobody cared. The booing continued. Every time Frank performed near a military base, servicemen showed up to heckle him. Some threw things, some shouted obscenities, some walked out. Frank tried to win them over, dedicated songs to soldiers, praised their sacrifice, donated money to war bonds. Nothing worked. The damage was done. In July 1945, the war in Europe ended. In August, Japan surrendered. The boys came home, and Frank thought maybe, finally, the anger would fade. But it didn't, because the men who came home remembered the men who didn't. And when they looked at Frank Sinatra, young, healthy, rich, untouched by war, they didn't see a man with a medical condition. They saw a man who'd gotten away with something. Frank tried to make amends. In September 1945, he volunteered for a USO tour. Not the glamorous kind that Bob Hope did, entertaining troops in safe locations with full press coverage. Frank requested the hard assignments, the hospitals, the rehabilitation centers, the places where broken men tried to piece their lives back together. Frank flew to military hospitals in Europe, visited wounded soldiers, sang for men missing limbs, men with burns, men with shell shock. He went from bed to bed, shook hands, asked names, asked about hometowns, tried to bring a moment of normalcy to men whose lives had been shattered, and some of them appreciated it. Some of them said thank you. Some of them asked for autographs, told Frank his music had kept them sane during the war. Those moments gave Frank hope that maybe eventually he could earn forgiveness. But others turned their backs when Frank walked in, refused to shake his hand. One soldier in a hospital in Frankfurt literally turned his face to the wall when Frank approached. Wouldn't look at him, wouldn't speak to him, just lay there, facing the wall, making his position clear. Frank stood by that bed for 2 full minutes, waiting, hoping the soldier would turn around. He never did. Frank finally walked away, feeling smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. The tour doctors told Frank not to take it personally, told him these men had been through hell. Their anger wasn't really about Frank. It was about everything they'd lost. But Frank took it personally anyway, because it was personal. They blamed him for staying safe, and Frank couldn't prove them wrong because they were right. He had stayed safe, and they hadn't. One incident haunted Frank forever. He was visiting a hospital in Germany, walked into a ward of men recovering from combat injuries, started talking to a soldier from Brooklyn. Kid was 21 years old, lost his left leg below the knee. Frank asked him what he needed. Anything. Frank would get it. The kid looked at Frank for a long moment. Then he said, "I need you to explain why I'm here and you're not." Frank had no answer, because there was no answer that made sense. The truth was genetic lottery, birth trauma, bad luck. But that truth felt obscene next to a 21-year-old kid with one leg. So Frank said nothing, just walked out of that ward and broke down crying in the hallway. Frank never talked about that moment publicly, but people close to him said it changed him, made him angry, made him defensive, made him bitter about the system that sent boys to die while celebrities got medical passes. Frank knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew he'd gotten lucky in a way that felt like stealing. The resentment followed Frank for decades. In 1950, when his career collapsed, when Columbia Records dropped him, when MGM fired him, some people said it was karma, said he deserved it for sitting out the war. In 1953, when Frank clawed his way back with From Here to Eternity, playing a soldier, winning an Oscar for it, some veterans said it was obscene, said Frank was profiting off a war he'd refused to fight. Frank never escaped it. In 1960, when he campaigned for John F. Kennedy, a decorated war hero, some people whispered that Frank was trying to borrow someone else's valor. In the 1970s, when Frank became a vocal supporter of the military, donated millions to veteran causes, some people said it was guilt money, payment for the sin of surviving. Frank died on May 14, 1998. He was 82 years old, and in the obituaries, in the retrospectives, in the career summaries, many of them mentioned it. Classified 4F in World War II, never served. As if that fact defined him as much as his voice, as if that absence mattered as much as his presence. The FBI file was finally declassified in 1998 after Frank's death. 47 pages confirming what Frank had said for 54 years. The medical condition was real, the classification was proper, no bribery occurred, no corruption existed. Frank Sinatra was innocent of everything except bad luck and bad timing. But the damage had been done, because in America, perception is reality. And the perception was set in 1943. Frank Sinatra didn't serve. Other men did. And whether he could have or should have didn't matter. He didn't. And that truth, fair or unfair, real or imagined, followed him to his grave. Here's what the FBI file revealed that Frank never talked about publicly. The forceps injury at birth wasn't just cosmetic. It caused chronic ear infections throughout his childhood. Frank missed months of school because of the pain, had 3 surgeries before age 12 trying to repair the damage. None of them worked. The eardrum never healed properly. The mastoiditis never fully resolved. By 1943, Frank's left ear had 40% hearing loss, and the military doctors knew that in combat, that hearing loss could get him killed, could get his unit killed. Frank could have explained this, could have gone public with the medical details, could have shown the childhood medical records, could have proven beyond doubt that he didn't choose this. But Frank didn't, because Frank came from a Sicilian family where you didn't explain yourself, where you didn't justify, where you took the hit and moved on. And that pride, that refusal to defend himself, cost him dearly. The soldiers who hated Frank weren't wrong to be angry. They weren't wrong to feel betrayed. War is hell. And watching someone avoid hell while you walk through it creates rage, justified rage. But they were wrong about one thing. Frank Sinatra didn't buy his way out. He didn't use influence. He didn't pull strings. He just got born with forceps that damaged his ear. And in the genetic lottery of who fights and who doesn't, Frank won. If you can call a lifetime of guilt and resentment winning,